Hello everyone, and welcome back to your tutorial for PSYC 201W. So this is tutorial 3, which will be on June 2nd of the semester. So there will be two parts of the tutorial today, two videos. First, in this video, we'll cover how to generate hypotheses, which are close cousins to research questions, and then we'll also discuss what independent and dependent variables are and how to choose them. I'll discuss the third weekly assignment at the end of this video, but I'll also urge you to go over to the second video for this week's tutorial right after, which is on APA formatting. So in that one, I lay out everything that's expected from your research report and proposal within structure-wise and formatting-wise. So it's really in your best interests to watch both videos this week before you get started on your third weekly assignment. And I will try and make both of the videos fairly short, just so they're manageable time-wise. Okay, the very first step in choosing your research question and your hypothesis is choosing a topic. You've already done this to an extent in your first and second weekly assignments. So this could be any somewhat narrowed area of psychology that is really interesting to you. And it's important that it's interesting to you because you're going to be working on this project for this whole semester. So it will take up a significant portion of your time. When you are choosing the questions that interest you right at the start of this course when completing your first and second weekly assignment, I hope you paused for a couple minutes and let your mind wander and thought about psychological topics that spark your curiosity. Additionally, you should have considered what topics you feel are actually worth researching. We covered this a little bit before, so we want to make sure the topics we conduct research on aren't just interesting to us, but interesting to many, and would be considered important by others in the field and even in the general public. So just as a quick aside, if you go on and if any of you become researchers for a living, either academic or industry, often you're submitting for grants that are funded by the federal government or from private organizations. So when you're applying for those grants, you have to submit proposals and justify why your topics are interesting to people. And especially if you're submitting for federal government grants, why why your research project should be funded by public taxpayer dollars. So right from the beginning, it's really important to build skills on how to articulate why you're interested or why your project is interesting to others in the field and to the general public. Remember the funnel analogy that was introduced last week? You can also use it much before you begin writing a literature review. You can use it to help generate your actual research question before you even begin the project. The top of the funnel is determined entirely by your own interests. What's interesting to you? From there, you've got to figure out what topics within that area that you find interesting may need more research. You may be interested in a certain topic, but once you've sat down and dived into the actual literature on that topic, you realize that many other people before you are really interested in it too, and there's been a ton of research done on it already. This might have actually happened to some of you when you selected one of your research questions from your first assignment and actually looked into the literature on them in your second assignment. That means that you're on the right track because you are thinking of questions that are interesting and important to other people, but you need to amend your question slightly by examining a different independent variable, a different dependent variable, or outcome variable, or examining the same question in a different population that hasn't been looked at yet, potentially. In other words, this is where you can identify a specific question that you could try and answer that would fill a gap in the literature. We can't just do the same research questions again and again, as that would be boring and a waste of time and funds. So once you've landed on a topic within a broader area of study, now it's time to drill down into a more specific research question. When you're letting yourself consider possible specific research questions for this project, you want to run them through a series of tests to see if the question is strong enough to use for your research project and if it'll work for the purposes of this course in particular. Specifically, you want to ask yourself, is this an empirical question? Is this topic too broad or vague? Are there more specific related questions that might be better suited for you to pick? What theories or concepts in psychology apply to this topic? Because then you should probably consider including them within your proposal in your paper. What observable actions or behaviors do we associate with this topic? What about attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs? That might become one of your independent variable or your dependent variable that relates to your first specified topic of interest in some way. What about this topic might be of public or scientific concern? What do you specifically find interesting about it, and what might others find interesting about it? And of course, is there any existing research on this topic that you should be incorporating into your proposal? So you'll see that answers to many of these questions are really important in just a minute on some slides that are coming up, when I run through an example of how to come up with a good research question and hypothesis for this class. Once you've landed on a specific research question, you've got to dig into the literature and see what's out there that's related to your question. We covered this step in detail last week in your second weekly assignment. What I've found in my experience is often you might have selected your research question and have it about 80% narrowed down, but you ultimately don't know if it's already been done before or if it's been settled in other ways tangentially. So it's imperative that you become familiar with the research surrounding your specific question or topic, which not only serves to reassure you that the question's novel, but may also cause you to slightly tweak it in other ways. So for example, you realize that other researchers have broadened or narrowed the outcome variable that you're interested in and have good rationale for doing so. Or that they found a third variable that seems to be related to the two initial variables you selected, so you decide that you want to include that one too. Once you've developed your question and know it would make a novel contribution to existing literature, you need to select and define your variables. What exactly are you going to measure? So as a quick refresher, this is what I mean by independent and dependent variables. The independent variable is the variable being changed or manipulated by you, or the one you think is going to have an effect on the outcome you're interested in. Thinking back to first year psych courses, remember that it's a true experiment if you as the researcher are manipulating the independent variable, but lots of research in psychology is not a true experiment. And the independent variable is in that case the variable that you think will have an effect on your outcome variable. So in other words, the independent variable might have different levels to it, or you might be noting down the reaction of the dependent variable depending on changes in the level or the presence or the absence of the independent variable. But you as the researcher may or may not be actually controlling those levels or the presence and absence of it. Then your dependent variable is your outcome variable of interest, the variable that is being acted upon or influenced by your independent variable, whether that influence is being manipulated by you as the researcher or not. So for an example, take this research question. What is the effect of antipsychotic medication A on symptoms of schizophrenia? Is this a true experiment or not? And what is the independent variable and dependent variable in this case? So I'll just give you a minute to think about this and answer this yourself. Okay, so it is a true experiment because you as the researcher are potentially randomly assigning your participants to either group 1, which is receiving the medication, or group 2, which is receiving a placebo. So you are manipulating that actively yourself. And the independent variable is whether participants are receiving the medication or a placebo, and the dependent variable is the symptoms of schizophrenia that you're observing in participants. So there are some important things you'll need to consider when selecting variables for this project. The first is, can you measure it? You need to be able to do that because we will be creating a figure or a table in your project, so you need some numerical measure of your variable. How will you define your variables? What variable is the independent variable whose effects you're wishing to test, and what is the dependent variable whose outcome you're wanting to measure? Once you've answered those questions, you can generate specific hypotheses that specify the relationship of your selected variables. So what exactly is a hypothesis? How is it different than a research question? Because it is different, and I have been separating the two. A hypothesis is a tentative proposition about the causes or outcomes of an event, or more generally, about how the variables in your research question are related. A research question is a question about the relationship between two or more variables. A hypothesis is a specific prediction about what the relationship is like. So your research question would look somewhat like, what is the effect of X on Y? So it's posed as an actual question, which you can see on the slide there. And then your hypothesis would look like the line beneath it, and often takes on an if X, then Y structure. So potentially, if X increases, then Y will decrease. So research question is a question, and the hypothesis is a statement. So now let's walk through an example. Say I'm a student in this course, and I've got to pick a topic. And I'm interested in personality traits, broadly speaking. I recognize that's way too broad, so I focus in a bit more and decide I'm most interested in extroversion, one of the big 5 personality traits. So I first need to check in. With this topic, can I generate a research question that I can put to the test and actually measure? Can I generate a question that ties into psychological theory? And is this an important topic? With something like a well-established construct in personality theory, I think I can say yes to all 3. So now I need to transform my topic into a refined question. Remember that research questions are questions about the relationship between 2 variables, an independent variable and an outcome or dependent variable. Okay, so since I'm interested in the general topic of extroversion, and I need to think of a research question that has 2 related variables, an independent and a dependent, I might land on the research question, what is the effect of extroversion, or my independent variable, on adherence to COVID-19 self-isolation restrictions? That's Y, my dependent variable. So once I have that, I've refined my research question, I'd then log on to PsycInfo and see what the existing literature has to say about this kind of question, just as you did in your second weekly assignment. Of course, since COVID-19 is a relatively new phenomenon, there may not be much about its relationship with extroversion, and I may have to bring in other related literature, like other types of personality traits that were linked to how well individuals followed restrictions. But make sure this is because you've done a comprehensive literature review and just nothing seems to be out there. Not just because you couldn't find anything within the first 10 search results, so you choose to just use something you've just found already. Now I have my question, and the next thing I need to do is select my actual variables and define them. So I need to define both of my variables operationally, meaning I need to specify in a concrete way what it means to adhere or not to adhere to self-isolation restrictions in my study for my purposes. So how will I determine who did and who did not adhere to self-isolation restrictions? There are a couple of ways I could do this. I could measure the number of times a person left their house in a given month during the pandemic, either by self-report or by installing a camera in participants' doorways. Of course, there are ethical issues with this. You could gather official records that state if participants had received fines for breaking restrictions. You could possibly develop a self-report questionnaire of adherence to all self-isolation restrictions. You could ask participants to self-report how many times they saw friends in a month. So there are a lot of options of how to operationally define this outcome variable or dependent variable. But as you can likely see, there are some problems with some of these options, most of them. People could be leaving their house for essential reasons, like work. I don't know about you, but it seems as if in BC at least, it's very hard to receive fines for not self-isolating. So using this operationalization might result in substantial underreporting of restriction breaking. If we're just considering someone who's broken a restriction as someone who's actually received a fine, as that doesn't seem to happen very often, and the restriction breaking has to be very grievous. It also might be difficult to obtain those official records. A score on a self-report survey may be a good option, but there may be no surveys developed yet that have been shown to validly measure this construct through research. So I might decide to go with a self-report of how many times a person saw friends in a month, but I would specify that it must have been for non-essential reasons. So seeing a friend at work at your essential job wouldn't count. Also, I would need to pick my month carefully, as in BC, restrictions have fluctuated over the pandemic, and at times it was okay to see certain individuals outside your household as long as you were in your set bubble. So I'd need to pick a month where this was not permitted, so it would be restriction breaking. Now, what about our independent variable, the thing whose effect I'm curious about? So this is extroversion, and how will I define this construct in my study? I could define it as how many friends a person reports that they have, or how many people they would typically hang out with in a pre-pandemic month. But you have to be careful here. You could see how measuring extroversion by number of friends and then measuring restriction breaking by number of friends seen in a month could possibly cause an artificial relationship to form. So this is when your independent and dependent variables are too similar and will be related because in reality, you're actually just measuring the same construct rather than capturing how two distinct constructs are related. So I want to be really careful here and make sure I'm capturing a different construct altogether for my independent variable. In this case, I'd choose a strong self-report measure of extroversion that's been used in many other research studies and has been found to capture the construct of extroversion validly. So now my research question is more specific, more concrete, and it's in operational language. Are individuals with higher scores on a self-reported measure of extroversion likely to break COVID-19 self-isolation restrictions to see more people outside of their household? Now I'd need to turn my research question into a hypothesis, which will basically be my guess about what I'm likely to find. So how are you supposed to know this? You haven't done the study yet. You're supposed to know it by surveying what researchers have found before you in similar studies, which is why you discuss the studies that are the closest to your own right before you discuss your own research question and then your hypothesis at the tip of your funnel in your literature review. In this case, even if there's scant research, I could make a decently informed guess based on my knowledge of the construct of extroversion. So looking at these possibilities, a higher score on the measure of extroversion could either increase, decrease, or have no effect on the likelihood of breaking restrictions. What do you think? Thinking about the construct of extroversion, I'm going to go with the top one. So in this case, even if there is scant research, I could make a decently informed guess based on this knowledge. And let's say that there have been previous studies that have found people who are more extroverted tend to have, say, more friends and see them more frequently. Even better, there could be a study or two that has found more extroverted people are more likely to be impulsive and break other sorts of rules pre-pandemic. Of course, this is hypothetical. I'm not throwing shade at anyone who's extroverted. So it makes the most sense that I'd find that individuals who scored higher on a measure of extroversion are more likely to break restrictions by seeing people outside of their household. Okay, so that ends our example and our tutorial, or this video of our tutorial today, and brings us to the instructions for your third assignment. So it's in 3 parts. Part 1 is defining 3 terms in your own words, and it should be in your own words. You shouldn't just be taking this from a textbook or my presentation. Hypothesis, independent variable, and dependent variable. Part 2, you're going to choose one of the articles you summarized in your weekly assignment last week and identify within it the hypothesis, the independent variable and how it was manipulated, and the dependent variable and how it was measured. So for these, you can copy it, you can express it in your own words, or you can copy and paste it if they do just outright state their hypothesis, but of course, then you should be citing the study and providing the page number. And we'll talk about that in the other tutorial video for this week on in-text citations. And then part 3, I want you to think about your own research project and state your own hypothesis. So I'm asking for the hypothesis here, not the research question. Be mindful of that. And identify the independent and dependent variables within that hypothesis and discuss why you think the variables will be related in the manner you stated in your hypothesis. So in that, 2 paragraphs maximum, don't go overboard. But I would expect some reference to previous literature, probably the literature that you talked about in the second weekly assignment, and some citations there too. So feel free to number each of these sections 1, 2, and 3, and within each section, answer each of the questions as 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, etc. So no need to work this into a fancy flowing essay or anything. Just answer each of the questions. The whole assignment should be roughly 2 pages double-spaced, give or take a little, so no need to write a 5-page long report either. And as a bonus, I urge you to start thinking about how you will manipulate your independent variable and measure your independent variable, manipulate your independent variable and measure your dependent variable for next week's lab. So that's a hint at what next week's assignment will focus on. But this is just something that you should start thinking about. You don't need to write anything about that this week. And as of right now, this assignment is less involved than last week's, so this will be due 24 hours after the tutorial's posted, the regular Thursday at 9:30 a.m. deadline, but I will keep you updated if that deadline changes. Now, that's all I have for today for hypothesis generation, but please go over and watch the next video on APA formatting now. And remember, drop-in office hours are 10 to 11 this week, and I'll be there if you have any questions. Have a great day.